Hello, and welcome to another edition of TMS TV. I'm here with Angus McIntyre. A year after you started, the exact change that policy came
It
into.
was actually the 1st of April of 1970, so I did that for about 7 months.
What was your reaction?
Well, it was a big relief to no longer have to work the changer. The changer here was in the cash box, and we had $120 as a cash fund provided by the company. So we were responsible for that money. We bought our tokens and our change and cashed in every day, every shift. And so this changer was on a bracket and there was a change dish. So what you did was when the person boarded, they put their dollar bill, they put their coins or whatever they wanted for change in the dish. And then you took that and put it here and gave them the tokens or the change. And then they put the money in the fare box and on they went. So this required, I mean, think about this. You're doing an 8-hour shift and all day long you're pressing these levers. So I remember telling one senior driver that my thumb was getting numb, and he said, "Oh, they're that used to it." Nobody knew about carpal tunnel syndrome then or anything. And sure enough, you did. And you had to be quick on the changer in order to be able to stay on time. And you could make change when you drove, except they didn't want you to make change or handle the money going through an intersection with traffic lights. The Granville Bridge was a good place to reload the changer because you could steer with your left hand. It was manual steering, and you could take rails of coins and tokens that you'd already prepared in advance. And then as you drove over the bridge or in the long straight, then you could fill the barrels up again. But you could run out. Like if your best plans and the purchases you made at the beginning of your shift at the depot office for your supplies, you could run out of dimes. And then you'd use up nickels, right? But we would stop another driver on the same line going in the other direction, and you'd run over and say, "Can you sell me a roll of dimes?" And say, "Oh, yeah, I've got an extra roll here," right? And so then you pay him and buy a roll of dimes. So a lot of the drivers pitched in to help if you had a problem like that.
I'm assuming that you didn't like working split shifts. How come you made the choice to go to nights?
I was always a night person to start with. I was never an early morning person. So evenings appealed to me. And so when we signed up, then I was able to finally get a split shift in the evening. They had other types of shifts that you could sign for. For example, you could do a day off block. So 2 days a week, you'd work a certain shift. 2 days a week, you'd work a different line, but the same sort of hours. And Friday was a separate sheet altogether. So the complexities of signing up were, and the ability to sign for individual type of work that you preferred was pretty good. So, and if you did holiday blocks, you could get better work usually. So there were all these different types of shifts that you could take. And so I was quite happy eventually to get a straight shift in the evening, say starting at 4 or 5 p.m. and finishing at 1 a.m. And so once I had settled in to that routine, which was probably around 1972, after about 2 or 3 years, there was quite a few retirements, so your seniority improved quite a bit.
So I've seen a video of the various operators at Oak Ridge copying down their times from wall charts. Can you explain how the paddle system evolved?
So when you started on the job, one of the things they trained you for was to translate a vertical chart, a vertical blueprint that showed a shift in times and timing points from a vertical chart. So these were in the bullpen and they were on these boards. These boards would fold in and out. So, and they were labeled for the different runs, the different routes. So what you do is so it's a Main Robson. You'd see MR, that stood for Main Robson. So you go over and there's all these vertical blueprints. Some were quite long and some were short. And then you had an assigned time period for your shift, which was part of that. So what you had to do was take that segment of the vertical arrangement and then translate it into a horizontal version, which was easier for you to do your run. And then you had to copy all this down. If you were on the extra board, you got a little stack of them because you might repeat something. And you eventually learned it by heart. So as time went on, if you worked for 3 months doing the same shift, you didn't need to look at your card anymore because you knew it by heart.
Well, how soon did they bring in the printed paddles?
So in 1971, BC Hydro, which was running the transit system, they decided, well, we've got this big new computer and it can do various things. Why don't we go and see if the transit system, the transportation division of BC Hydro, would like to do something with this computer? This was an early time of computers, And Vancouver was the first transit system that I know of in North America to actually print out these times for the drivers in what were then called, we filled out run cards. What we used were called run cards, but they didn't want to use that term. They wanted something new. And apparently Los Angeles used that same term of paddle to describe what the drivers there used for their shifts. So BC Hydro just adopted that term. And sure enough, for the first time, we actually had these printed, computer printed. And you think back to those early days when they would print things in designs from computers to show you how they could work and so on. These were just numbers and the timing points. And they learned fairly quickly they needed to print the timing points on the top and the bottom because they were two-sided. Some of the paddles were two-sided. And then shade the different rows. So eventually, from the very first ones, which were very plain, they fine-tuned them, and then those became the standard. While other cities like Toronto kept using blueprints and the drivers copying down their times until the computers came in and GPS came in much more recently.
So eventually, you settled into your niche of, I guess, doing Fourth Avenue at night.
Well, it was the Powell Street runs. So
Yeah.
at first, it was Stanley Park, Powell, and Nanaimo. So those were routed through downtown. In the 1980s, they broke those up into the Fourth Powell and the Dunbar Nanaimo, and changed the numbers around. The seventh survived as the Dunbar, but they kept switching around. So the Powell Street runs were easier runs to do along the waterfront than Hastings. In those days, Hastings still had, although it was nowhere near what it became eventually today, it was a much heavier line. On Powell Street, even though you were just 2 or 3 blocks north of Hastings, the clientele were there. A lot of them were regulars. It was friendlier. It was just a little more comfortable. And I really enjoyed doing an east side, west side route. So for example, Dunbar, Nanaimo, you got the east side and the west side, and then a bit of mingling in between, and the Fourth and the Powell. But it's the same sort of thing. You had an interesting variation in your daytime routine. It wasn't all the same.
And did you find that there was a difference between the clientele?
Oh, absolutely. East side and the west side of the city, for sure. It's to this day. I mean, it's the generally speaking, the loads on the east side were heavier. depending on where you were, but the west side could also be very busy. And then the hookups, for example, the Dunbar used to go along Broadway, and then they started to run it along Fourth Avenue to help with the Fourth Oak service. So as the years went by, the way the city was growing and the demands for service were starting to change. So, so I retired from the Dunbar and Nanaimo, my neighborhood. I lived on the west side. A bus driver could buy a house in 1977 on the west side. So another part I enjoyed doing the Dunbar and Nanaimo was it was my neighborhood, and I would have my neighbors and friends get on the bus to go places. So that was fun. That was a bonus.
Now, you're a naturally outgoing person. How did you how did you find your interactions with your, I guess, your regular passengers?
The the evening shift, see, the best part about doing an evening shift was typically I would start at 4 o'clock, and you had one rush hour trip. And the rush hour back then it was at 5 o'clock for like 30 minutes. You had an intense rush hour. Most of the trolley bus routes in the city had a 2-minute service at 5 o'clock because there's just this huge crush of people. You turn off of Robson onto Granville as a Hastings Express, do a short turn. You turn that corner in 3 stops at 5:10. You couldn't get another person on the bus. It was jammed full, and then you'd get to Main and Express out to Kootenay Loop. So everything happened at that time. By the time I retired, the rush hour started at 2 and finished at 7, if you're lucky. So that was another difference, was that you had more intensity for a short period. And then the rest of the evening got easier unless there was a bingo game let loose at 10 o'clock. So there were places that you got to know, like the bingo halls, and all the bingo ladies would all show up. That was another aspect to the job in the evening, was there was big sports events out at the exhibition park. There was wrestling out there. They ran wrestling special buses to handle the crowds. So the venues for events around the city required extra service. The races, the Powell bus went out to the racetrack. So you got all the race enthusiasts on your bus. And then the early users would get on before the races were over, and sometimes they wouldn't have enough money to pay the fare.
Well, this brings up another another question. How did the passengers, did they respect you? I'm I'm assuming that fare evasion was it rampant then, or
It was virtually non-existent. I mean, we had $120 here. They would actually check to see if we had $120 on our bus. Like at Broadway and Granville, the corner supervisor could come over. He was known as the popsicle stick guy, and he would actually measure how much was in each, because he had marks on the popsicle sticks, and he'd measure how much was in your changer. And the $1 bill went in this shirt pocket, and the $2 bills went in this pocket. And so that, what you were doing was, at the end of the line, was organizing and counting all your money and cashing in at the end of the day. So we walked, everyone knew in our uniform that we were walking around with $120 or $150. And yet robberies were few and far between until close to the April 1970 exact fare day. The robberies were starting to increase. Many U.S. cities had already gone to the exact fare, but Vancouver was the first Canadian city to do so. So it was extremely rare, and usually it was a genuine problem when somebody got on without being able to pay the fare. Particularly if they were a little kid and they ran out of money, you'd always let them on. You wouldn't question that. So this cap, when I was in training, the instructor said, when you need to go down the aisle to deal with the problem in the back of the bus, because we were responsible for discipline on the bus, and there was respect and there was compliance. As soon as you put the cap on, which I usually didn't wear unless the weather was bad, but that ramped you up into another step of authority because it was like the police. Police were very willing to get on your bus to help you with the problem. Downtown, we frequently were able to have them. You had to find a payphone to get help because we had no radios. So actually, um, the fare evasion was so unusual that if it was chronic, sometimes the police came, like a supervisor came, and the police came. I mean, by the time I retired, 40 people a night locked down without paying. And you just had to turn your head and let them go. So 1990 was probably the turning point of the public, the passengers no longer having the kind of respect or compliance from the driver that we had always had. And I left the UBC loop, and this guy was starting smoking in the second back seat. So I went back to deal with it. At that time, we were still doing that. And sure enough, um, he was non-compliant. And until I said, well, the bus can't move until this is right. That's the first time I remember running into that somebody was not going to follow instructions. My way, now, when I did start on the job, one of my final interviews, um, I was told, well, you tend to be shy by nature, so you may have trouble throwing drunks off the bus. And this was someone who'd started on the streetcars, and he worked his way up and became an operations supervisor. So um, I found it was much easier to learn how to talk people off the bus rather than physically throwing them off. And one of the best ways that usually worked was when somebody's refusing to get off and they're at the front and so on, and they're non-compliant. You just change your tone and just say, well, just watch your step when you're getting off there. Be careful when you're getting off. Oh, okay, and they'd get off. Like, so often the psychology part of it would work better. So right away, when I started to drive from the very beginning, people were trying to fudge their transfers. They were playing games, and so that was another side of it, was that for the first time, I was dealing with the public and dealing with the traffic, and we didn't have any right-hand mirrors on the buses. So, you're suddenly out there in a city that, while the traffic was not as intense, as volume and aggressive as it is now, it was still busy. There was still a lot of traffic at certain times. And so, um, but uh, the actual handling of the money, when that first exact fair day came, your reflexes were still there, and people they didn't know. People would get on with the dollar bill, and you see the dollar bill, and you'd reach for the changer that wasn't there. So we were actually able to buy our changers back. It was a brand new changer. It had extra 2 barrels on it here. And so it was $5 for, these were $35, and it was a lot of money back then. And the really old changers from the streetcar days were just $2. I should have bought a couple of those too. So, and then we had punches here for our transfers, right? The holster. So that was the other thing we were doing. And the the payphones were everywhere in the city, so you never felt at risk too much, because particularly on Main Street, from top to bottom, I think every 2 blocks there was a payphone, a corner store. There were lots of places to do that, and once you used up enough dimes, you could go into the depot office and they'd give you $1 in back for the phone calls that you make.